All right, today we're jumping into a really intense interview between Tucker Carlson and Mike Huckabee, who was the U.S. ambassador to Israel. And let me tell you, this conversation, it really shines a light on some major fault lines in American conservatism and the whole very complicated U.S.-Israel alliance. So this was a marathon, 2.5 hour talk, but the tension was already there before they even hit record. Tucker Carlson himself kind of sets the stage with this quote, calling the trip brief and highly intense. That's a pretty clear signal that we're about to see an ideological clash. You know, before they even got into the meat of their debate, Carlson describes this whole series of, let's call them, frustrating hurdles, both logistically and diplomatically, that he says created a really tense, almost adversarial vibe for the whole thing. So Carlson lays out this pretty startling sequence of events. First, he says his team's request for security gets shot down by the U.S. Embassy for what they called legal reasons. Okay. Then they get handed off to an Israeli ministry where the deputy had just recently called him an enemy of Israel. Yikes. He even claims the embassy wouldn't pass on their flight info at first. But the wildest claim, he alleges that after the interview, his producers were actually interrogated by Israeli security. So Carlson's point is that this wasn't just a tough interview. It was an atmosphere of obstruction right from the get-go. So with all that as the backdrop, the conversation begins. And Carlson doesn't waste any time. He goes right at Huckabee, challenging him on actions he took as ambassador, and he's laser-focused on one thing. Who are you accountable to, and where does your allegiance really lie? The first real fireworks go off over a meeting Huckabee had with a convicted spy, a man who literally betrayed the United States. And this just immediately brings up the fundamental question. When you're the U.S. ambassador, whose side are you on? And the spy in question is this guy, Jonathan Pollard. To really get why this is such a big deal, you have to know who he is. Carlson calls him the most damaging spy in modern American history. This wasn't some minor offense. He was convicted of selling top-secret U.S. intelligence to Israel. So yeah, he's a pretty central figure in any debate about loyalty. And right here, you can see their two worlds just collide. For Carlson, meeting with this guy is basically endorsing a traitor. His question is simple. Why would you ever do that? But Huckabee sees it completely differently. He says, look, it was just a brief courtesy meeting because Pollard wanted to thank him for a condolence note. He paints it as just a moment of human decency, totally separate from politics. And to really hammer his point home, Carlson pulls this direct quote from Pollard. He argues, see, this isn't some repentant guy. This is someone actively telling other people to spy against the U.S. For Carlson, this quote makes Huckabee's meeting seem completely unbelievable. So the topic of loyalty broadens out. It's not just about spies anymore. Now it's about justice. Carlson starts pressing Huckabee on why he claims dozens of American fugitives, including accused sex offenders, are able to just hide out in Israel, totally shielded from the U.S. justice system. And again, they just hit a wall. Their disagreement here boils down to whose job it is. Carlson is basically saying, as the ambassador, you have a moral duty to demand these people be sent back. But Huckabee's position is, hey, that's a legal issue for the Department of Justice. He says his office never got an official request to step in. So another total impasse on who's responsible. All right. All of this builds to what is really the intellectual heart of the whole interview. This dizzying circular debate about theology and land, where the two of them literally cannot agree on the most basic definitions of the words they're using. So Huckabee starts by offering what seems like a pretty simple definition of Christian Zionism, but Carlson immediately starts pulling it apart thread by thread, questioning what every single part of that sentence actually means. And that's what sends them down this 2-hour-long rabbit hole. First up, Carlson wants to know, where does this right even come from? Is it a command from God in the Bible, or is it something based on modern international law? He really tries to force Huckabee to pick a lane. Next he goes, okay, who exactly are the people here? Are we talking about a religious group, an ethnic group? He points out what he sees as a contradiction in Israeli law, and suddenly they're in a circular argument about identity that they just never get out of. And finally, the question of borders. Carlson says, look, if the claim to the land comes from the Bible, as you suggest, well, the Bible lays out borders that are way bigger than the modern state of Israel. And this creates a huge paradox. On one hand, Carlson is reading from Genesis, saying the biblical deed is for land from the Nile to the Euphrates. On the other hand, Huckabee says that politically, Israel isn't trying to claim all that land today, which leaves you with this big unanswered question. If your justification is biblical,
why aren't the borders biblical? And if it's political, why bring the Bible into it at all?
So after hours of this intellectual sparring, things finally boil over. The conversation takes a sharp turn, and we hit a raw emotional flashpoint over the war in Gaza. When Carlson asks about the thousands of children killed in Gaza, Huckabee puts the blame squarely on Hamas. Then he starts praising the Israeli military's methods for preventing civilian deaths, things like sending texts or dropping leaflets before a strike. And to really drive home how careful he thinks the Israeli military is, Huckabee makes this direct comparison. He claims they take steps to avoid civilian casualties that, in his words, even the United States military doesn't. Well, that did it. That line prompts an immediate, and I mean sharp, reaction from Carlson. He doesn't see it as a defense of Israel. He hears it as a direct criticism, a dig at his own country's military. And this final exchange, it's basically the whole interview in a nutshell. Huckabee swears he wasn't criticizing the U.S., just trying to highlight what he sees as Israel's extraordinary methods. But Carlson just fires back, challenging that claim and arguing it proves Huckabee's real priority is to defend a foreign government's military over his own. In the end, there's no resolution. They don't hug it out. And it leaves us, the audience, with this really fundamental question. In a world of complicated alliances, when the story from a close friend clashes with the story of your own country, where does an American representative's ultimate allegiance really truly lie?